The horse's breath steamed in the dawn cold as Eli's trembling hands fumbled with the rope. His sister's face, pale as winter bone, lips cracked from fever, burned behind his eyes. 3 days without food. The trading post owner had laughed when Eli begged for scraps. Now the stolen mare beneath him represented everything: hope, desperation, damnation. The Lakota scout emerged from the pines like a shadow given form, his dark eyes reading the boy's soul in a single glance. "You steal to feed death," Akacheta said quietly, "or to feed life?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The morning mist clung to Redwood Crossing like the breath of ghosts, and Eli Brandt moved through it with the careful silence of a boy who had learned that noise meant discovery, and discovery meant punishment. His bare feet found the soft patches between the frozen ruts in the trading post's yard, each step calculated to avoid the betraying crunch of ice. The stolen mare stood tethered behind Morrison's store, her coat dark with dew, her eyes liquid and trusting in the grey light. Eli's stomach cramped with hunger so fierce it felt like claws raking his insides, but it was not his own emptiness that drove him forward. It was the memory of his sister's hand, light as a bird's wing, falling away from the crust of bread he had pressed to her lips the night before. Sarah had not eaten in 3 days. The fever that burned through her small body had stolen her appetite along with her strength, and Eli watched helplessly as she grew thinner, more translucent, like a candle burning down to nothing. At 11 years old, she was all he had left of family, all he had left of love, and the thought of losing her carved a hollow space in his chest that no amount of food could fill. The other orphans at the mission had learned to fend for themselves or perish, but Sarah was different, gentle where the world demanded hardness, trusting where it rewarded suspicion. She believed in goodness the way others believed in God. With a faith that made Eli both protective and afraid, the mare shifted as he approached, her ears pricking forward with curiosity rather than alarm. Eli had watched her for days, noting how Morrison treated her with the casual indifference of a man who owned too much to value any of it properly. She was well-fed, well-groomed, worth more than Eli could earn in a year of odd jobs and begging. But she was also gentle, patient, the kind of horse that would carry a sick child without complaint. His hands shook as he reached for the lead rope, not from cold but from the weight of what he was about to become. A thief, a criminal, a boy who had crossed a line he could never uncross. The rope felt heavy in his palms, rough hemp that scraped against skin already raw from work and worry. Eli had stolen before, apples from orchards, bread from windowsills, small things that might be overlooked or forgiven. But this was different. This was a horse, valuable and visible, the kind of theft that brought posses and nooses. Yet as he thought of Sarah's labored breathing, the way her ribs showed through her nightgown like the bars of a cage, he knew he would steal 100 horses if it meant saving her. Love, he had learned, made criminals of them all. The mare followed him willingly as he led her away from the trading post, her hooves muffled by the soft earth. Eli had planned this moment for days, mapping the trails that led away from town, identifying the places where a boy and a horse might disappear into the wilderness. He would ride to the next settlement, sell the mare for whatever he could get, and return with medicine and food. It was a desperate plan, full of holes and hope in equal measure, but it was the only plan he had. The alternative, watching Sarah fade away while he stood helpless, was unthinkable. As they reached the edge of the pines, Eli paused to look back at Redwood Crossing, its buildings grey and indistinct in the morning mist. Somewhere behind those walls, Sarah lay sleeping, her breath shallow and quick, her small hand clutching the rag doll that was her only possession. He had kissed her forehead before leaving, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep, and the memory of her trust burned in him like a brand. Whatever happened next, whatever price he paid for this theft, it would be worth it if it bought her one more day, one more chance to see the world that had been so cruel to them both. The Lakota scout materialized from the forest, like smoke taking human form, his presence so sudden and complete that Eli's heart seemed to stop beating altogether. One moment the trail ahead was empty, dappled with morning light filtering through pine boughs, and the next, Akecheta stood there, as if the earth itself had shaped him from shadow and silence. His dark hair hung loose around shoulders wrapped in a worn buckskin shirt, and his eyes, deep brown and unreadable, fixed on Eli with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. The stolen mare snorted and sidled nervously, sensing the tension that crackled between the man and boy like lightning before a storm. Eli's first instinct was to run, to wheel the horse around and flee back toward town, but something in the scout's stillness held him frozen. Akecheta made no move toward the weapons at his belt, showed no sign of aggression or alarm. Instead, he studied Eli with a patience that was somehow more unnerving than anger would have been. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the mare's restless breathing and the distant call of a crow. When Akecheta finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, each word carefully chosen like stones placed in a stream. "You ride a horse that knows you are not its master," the scout said, his English accented but precise. "It follows you because horses are kind, not because you have earned its trust." His gaze shifted to the mare, taking in her fine breeding, her well-maintained tack, the obvious signs of careful ownership. "This animal belongs to the trader Morrison. He will notice its absence before the sun climbs much higher." The statement hung in the air like a judgment, neither accusation nor absolution, simply truth spoken without embellishment. Eli found his voice, though it came out cracked and smaller than he intended. "I'll bring her back," he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. I need to get to Millerville. My sister, she's sick and I need medicine." The words tumbled out in a rush, desperation making him careless, with secrets he had guarded so carefully. "I'll work to pay for the horse, I'll do anything. But she's dying, and I can't just watch her die." His voice broke on the last word, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks, ashamed of his weakness, but unable to stop the truth from spilling out. Akecheta's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition or understanding that was gone too quickly to interpret. He stepped closer to the mare, his movements fluid and unhurried, and placed a hand on her neck. The horse calmed immediately under his touch, her nervous energy settling into stillness. "I know this sickness you speak of," he said quietly. "I have seen it take the young and leave the old to grieve. It is a hunger that food cannot fill, a cold that fire cannot warm." His fingers traced the mare's mane with gentle familiarity, as if he had known her all her life. The scout's next words came like a physical blow, unexpected and devastating in their simplicity. "You steal this horse to save your sister, but you will only succeed in killing yourself." He looked up at Eli, and for the first time, the boy saw something like compassion in those dark eyes. "Morrison has already sent word to the sheriff. There are men with guns and ropes looking for the boy who took his prize mare. They will find you before you reach Millerville, and they will not ask questions before they act." The truth of it settled over Eli like a shroud, heavy and suffocating, and he felt the last of his hope crumble into dust. But then Akecheta did something that changed everything. He reached up and placed his hand on Eli's leg, the touch firm and warm through the boy's thin trousers. "Get down," he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "If you wish to save your sister, you will need more than a stolen horse and a desperate heart. You will need wisdom and patience, and the kind of help that cannot be bought or stolen." As Eli slid from the mare's back, his legs shaking with exhaustion and fear, he looked into the scout's face and saw something that made his breath catch, not judgment or pity, but recognition, as if Akecheta was seeing not a thief, but a reflection of himself. The fire crackled between them like a living thing, casting dancing shadows across Akecheta's weathered face as he studied the boy who sat rigid as a cornered animal. Eli's hands trembled around the tin cup of bitter coffee, the warmth seeping through his fingers like a promise he didn't dare believe. The stolen horse stood tethered nearby, its flank still heaving from the desperate ride, and in the amber light it looked less like salvation and more like the instrument of his doom. Akecheta's silence stretched long and heavy, filled with the weight of judgment that Eli had been running from his entire life. When the scout finally spoke, his voice carried the cadence of wind through prairie grass, low and measured. "Tell me about your sister." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, and he nearly dropped the cup as his defenses crumbled. No adult had ever asked about Sarah with such quiet intensity, as if her existence mattered beyond the burden she represented. His throat worked soundlessly for a moment before the words came tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "She's 8, and she's dying, and I don't know how to stop it." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and desperate, and Eli felt something inside his chest crack open like an egg. Akecheta nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, and in that simple gesture, Eli glimpsed something he had never seen before: understanding without judgment, acceptance without conditions. The scout reached into his leather pouch and withdrew a piece of dried meat, offering it with the same solemnity another man might offer gold. "Hunger makes thieves of honest men," Akecheta said, his English careful and deliberate, each word chosen like stones for a foundation. "But it also reveals the heart beneath the desperation." Eli took the meat with shaking hands, tearing at it with teeth that hadn't known real food in days, and as the salt and smoke filled his mouth, he felt tears he had been holding back for weeks finally spill over. The scout watched him eat without speaking, his presence steady as a mountain, and gradually Eli felt the knot of terror in his chest begin to loosen. When he finally looked up, Akecheta was staring into the fire, his profile carved from shadow and flame, and Eli saw in the lines around his eyes the weight of losses that mirrored his own. "I had a son once," the scout said quietly, and the words fell between them like stones into still water. "He would have been your age now." The admission hung in the night air, heavy with grief that Eli recognized in his bones. He had seen that same hollow look in his own reflection, the way loss carved itself into a person's face until it became part of their landscape. Akecheta's hands rested on his knees, scarred and strong, and Eli noticed how they trembled almost imperceptibly, as if the memory of his son still lived in his fingertips. "What happened to him?" Eli whispered, though part of him already knew the answer would be another kind of breaking. The scout was quiet for so long that Eli thought he wouldn't answer, but then Akecheta's voice came again, softer now, like wind through dry leaves. "Sickness took him, and his mother, in the same winter." The words carried the weight of a man who had learned that love and loss were often the same thing, and Eli felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. "I left my people after that," Akecheta continued, his gaze still fixed on the flames that seemed to hold all the ghosts of his past. "Could not bear to see the places where they had laughed, where they had run, where they had been." Eli understood that kind of running, the way grief could make even familiar ground feel like enemy territory. He had been running too, in his own way, from the memory of parents who had loved him and Sarah before the fever took them, from the weight of promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The scout turned to look at him then, and in his eyes Eli saw not the hardened warrior who had caught him stealing, but a father who had lost everything and somehow found the strength to keep breathing. "But tonight, watching you fight for your sister, I remember what it means to protect something precious." "Indeed." The words settled over Eli like a blanket, warm and unexpected, and for the first time in months he felt something other than fear. Akecheta stood and moved to his pack, returning with a small leather pouch that he pressed into Eli's hands. Inside were coins, more money than the boy had seen in his entire life, and his eyes widened with disbelief. "This will buy medicine for your sister and food for both of you," the scout said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made a decision that would change everything. But first, you will return the horse to its owner and ask forgiveness." Eli's heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the money, understanding that this was more than charity. It was a test, a chance to prove he was more than the desperate thief circumstances had made him. When he looked up at Akecheta, he saw in the scout's face the same fierce protectiveness he felt for Sarah, and realized that somehow, in the space of a single conversation, he had become something he had never been before, someone worth saving. Dawn broke over Redwood Crossing like a wound in the sky, painting the wooden buildings and dusty streets in shades of amber and blood. Eli walked beside Akecheta toward the trading post, leading the stolen horse by its reins, each step feeling like a march toward his own execution. The weight of the coins in his pocket should have been comforting, but instead they felt like stones, heavy with the responsibility of proving himself worthy of the scout's unexpected faith. The few early risers they passed stared openly at the unlikely pair, the Lakota warrior and the scrawny white boy, their faces reflecting the kind of suspicion that had followed Eli his entire life. But with Akecheta beside him, steady and unshakable as granite, Eli found a courage he didn't know he possessed, a strength borrowed from the man who had chosen to see potential where others saw only problems. The trading post owner, a thick-set man named Morrison, with hands like ham hocks and a face that had forgotten how to smile, emerged from his store as they approached. His eyes fixed immediately on the horse, then on Eli, and his expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Well, well," Morrison growled, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had been proven right about the worst in people. "Looks like we found our horse thief." Eli's knees nearly buckled under the weight of the man's contempt, but Akecheta's presence beside him was like an anchor in a storm. The scout stepped forward slightly, not threatening but unmistakably protective, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced down greater dangers than an angry shopkeeper. "The boy comes to make things right," Akecheta said simply, and something in his tone made Morrison's bluster falter. Eli forced himself to step forward, his voice cracking as he spoke the words that felt like swallowing glass. "I stole your horse, Mr. Morrison, and I'm sorry." The admission hung in the morning air, stark and honest, and Eli saw surprise flicker across the man's weathered features. "I was desperate and scared, and I thought it was the only way to save my sister, but that don't make it right." His hands shook as he extended the reins, offering back the animal that had represented his last hope, and in that moment he felt the full weight of what it meant to choose honor over survival. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Eli braced himself for the blow he was certain would come. Instead, the man's voice came out gruff but not unkind. "Takes guts to come back, boy. More guts than most men have." The unexpected mercy in Morrison's words hit Eli harder than any punishment could have, and he felt tears threaten again as the man continued. "Your sister, she the little blonde girl been coughing herself to death over at the boarding house?" When Eli nodded, unable to trust his voice, Morrison's expression softened further. "Been wondering what happened to you two after your folks passed." The admission revealed a kindness that Eli had never suspected existed beneath the man's gruff exterior, and he realized that perhaps he had been so focused on survival that he had missed the possibility of compassion. Morrison looked between Eli and Akecheta, seeming to weigh something in his mind, before making a decision that would echo through both their lives. "Tell you what, boy, you work for me for a month, mucking stalls and hauling supplies, and we'll call it even." The offer was more generous than Eli had dared hope for, and he felt Akecheta's hand settle briefly on his shoulder, a touch that conveyed pride and approval. But Morrison wasn't finished, and his next words carried the weight of a man who understood the delicate balance between justice and mercy. "And if your sister needs medicine, you come to me first. No more stealing, no more running. A man faces his problems head-on." Eli nodded so vigorously he thought his neck might snap, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness of a world that had shown him mostly cruelty. As they shook hands, Morrison's grip firm and honest, Eli felt something fundamental shift inside him. The understanding that redemption was possible, that mistakes didn't have to define a person forever. When they turned to leave, Akacheta walking beside him, with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher whose student had passed an important test, Eli realized that the scout had given him something more valuable than money or protection. He had given him the chance to become the kind of man worth being. The walk back to where Sarah waited felt different now, lighter somehow despite the weight of responsibility that still pressed on Eli's shoulders. Akacheta moved with the fluid grace of a man completely at home in his own skin, and Eli found himself trying to match that confidence, that sense of belonging in the world. "You did well," the scout said as they reached the edge of town, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine approval. "Your sister will be proud." The words settled into Eli's chest like seeds in fertile ground, and he realized that for the first time in his life, he had someone who believed in him, not despite his mistakes, but because of how he chose to face them. As they walked toward an uncertain but suddenly hopeful future, Eli understood that sometimes the greatest gift one person could give another was the chance to prove they were better than their worst moment. Sarah's fever broke on the third day, her small body finally surrendering to the medicine that Akacheta's coins had bought, and as Eli watched the color return to her pale cheeks, he felt something inside his chest expand like a flower opening to sunlight. The boarding house room that had felt like a tomb for weeks now seemed filled with possibility, and when Sarah's eyes fluttered open and focused on his face, her smile was like dawn after the longest night. "Eli," she whispered, her voice still weak but blessedly clear, and he had to bite his lip to keep from sobbing with relief. Akacheta sat in the corner, his presence as steady and reassuring as it had been since he'd first followed them back to town. And when Sarah's gaze found him, she showed no fear, only the curious acceptance that children possessed before the world taught them to be afraid of differences. "Who's your friend?" Sarah asked, struggling to sit up against the thin pillows, and Eli felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized how to answer. The word came out before he could stop it, carrying a weight of meaning that surprised them both. "Family," he said simply, and saw Akacheta's eyes widen slightly before a slow smile spread across his weathered features. It was true in ways that went deeper than blood or law, this bond that had formed between them in the space of desperate need and unexpected compassion. Sarah studied the scout with the frank curiosity of childhood, taking in his braided hair and the beadwork on his shirt, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. "Are you going to stay with us?" she asked, and the hope in her voice was so naked and pure that Eli felt his heart break a little. Akacheta rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside the bed, his movements careful and deliberate, as if approaching something precious and fragile. When he spoke, his voice carried the solemnity of a sacred vow. "If you will have me, little sister, I would be honored to call you family." The formal words were softened by genuine warmth, and Sarah's face lit up with a joy that seemed to fill the entire room. She reached out with one thin hand to touch the beadwork on his sleeve, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns with wonder. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and Akacheta's smile deepened as he began to tell her the story behind each symbol, his voice weaving pictures of sky and earth, of eagles and running water. Eli watched them together and felt something settle into place inside him, a sense of rightness that he had never experienced before. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt like the beginning of a new life, with Akacheta teaching them both skills that went far beyond mere survival. He showed Eli how to track game through the forest, how to read the signs that nature left for those who knew how to look, how to move through the world with purpose instead of desperation. But more than that, He taught him what it meant to be a man, not through harsh words or impossible expectations, but through example, through the quiet strength of someone who had faced loss and chosen to love again anyway. Sarah grew stronger each day under his gentle attention, her laughter returning like birdsong after winter, and Eli marveled at how the scouts seemed to know exactly what each of them needed without being told. One evening, as they sat around a small fire outside the boarding house, Sarah asleep between them, wrapped in Akacheta's own blanket, the scout spoke words that would change everything. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "about what it means to be a father." Eli looked up from the stick he'd been whittling, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. "I lost my son to sickness, but perhaps the spirits have given me another chance." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and hope, and Eli felt tears he didn't try to hide spill down his cheeks. "I would be honored to call you my son, Eli Brandt, if you would have an old warrior for a father. The formal adoption might never be recognized by white man's law, but in that moment, under the vast Montana sky, it felt more real and binding than any document could ever be." "Yes," Eli whispered, the word carrying the weight of every prayer he'd never dared to speak, every wish he'd been afraid to voice. "Yes, I would like that very much." Akacheta reached across the fire and placed his hand on Eli's shoulder, the touch conveying a promise that went deeper than words: protection, guidance, unconditional love. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, Eli understood that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the worst disasters. His desperate theft of a horse had led him not to punishment, but to the family he had always dreamed of having. Sarah stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that might have been "Papa," and both men smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. They were no longer alone in the world, no longer just surviving. They were a family, bound not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the unbreakable ties that form when broken souls choose to heal together.